What's going on, guys? This is Rob, and we are back with X-Men Red, i.e. the Omega level Mutant Civil War. Yes, this is part of Marvel's Fall of X event, but it is also a little bit separate at the same time. Those of you guys who are behind, you'll find a link to the Fall of X playlist at the end of this video. But the long and short of what's going on here is that this takes place after the stalemate, which is to say, the forces of Storm versus the forces of Genesis. What does that mean? So a lot of you guys already know who Storm is. Genesis is kind of the antithesis to Storm in a lot of different ways. They're very similar, but they're very different. Storm fights for justice and the rights of mutant kind and so on and so forth. All the things you normally expect from the mutant population. But Genesis and her forces come from Arakko, this long-lost land out there in another dimension that was filled with mutants that we never knew about before, who were all just overpowered. But the war between Genesis and Storm is really awesome because Genesis only knows war. She believes that, you'll be tested on the battlefield, and if you survive, you'll be stronger for the victory. And mutants just need to consistently be as strong as possible. The problem here is that in the fight they had, neither side could overcome the other. So a kind of ceasefire, at least an unofficial ceasefire, was called in the sense that Genesis retreated her forces, and now she's taking to the sea. And this is due to the fact that she realizes that among Storm's forces, they don't have anyone that can control the water. They don't have anybody that can control the oceans. Namor the Submariner is not here. And one of the things that we would largely have to assume, I don't know if Marvel's really confirmed this the way they have with Storm and being able to manipulate the weather on any planet or even in space. I don't know if Namor the Submariner would be able to dominate sea life on another world. But even then, it doesn't matter, because what happens here is that when Genesis gets her forces to the ocean, her stance is, we are going to manipulate sea life for our own end, so we can literally take the various organisms in the ocean and bolster our forces and use them against Storm. Now, Sobanar is totally against this, and Sobanar is kind of like Genesis' version of Namor the Submariner, right? That kind of character. Namor's a mutant within Marvel Comics. He's usually part of the Avengers or the X-Men, associates with them loosely, so on and so forth. But Sobanar commands the seas, and the response of Sobanar is, I'm not okay with you doing this. But the response of Genesis is, it doesn't matter. So what she ends up doing is basically approaching Cohen, who is basically a werewolf with two heads. And the idea here is that it represents stalemates. Now that's one of the things, for those of you guys who are unfamiliar with the forces of Arakko, everything is symbolism. The roles that people play, their physical appearance oftentimes directly reflects the role they play. With Cohen, it's one of these things where both heads are able to kind of see the most logical course that they can take. And while it's not really precognitive in the sense that he can't see the future, it's more or less deducing logic and reason. And his response is, we should defer to you, great Genesis, on all things. Now, the reality here is that Genesis is vying for power, and she could easily kill almost everybody here. I say almost because there's one person here whom she could never harm. But in reality, as part of a play for power, people will effectively bend the knee in order to earn the favor of the person that's vying for power. So you can make a legitimate argument here that Cohen's basically lie, right? And essentially saying, well, of course we need to follow your wisdom, great Genesis. Of course we should do that, because it curries favor with Genesis, so that when the time comes when this war's basically over, and as far as they're concerned, she becomes the absolute ruler, then that in turn would basically allow them to curry favor with her and achieve some high-ranking position or something along those lines. But there are others who stand against her. But then Aura Serrata steps in and says, let there be silence. This is what's going to happen. So the question has to be asked, how is it that Aura Serrata can just dominate the entirety of the conversation? Because Aura Serrata is crazy overpowered. Aura Serrata is so ridiculously OP. But there is a caveat, right? So Aura Serrata sits on this giant eye. And the thing about this is that the eye will wipe from existence whatever it looks at. If Aura Serrata fires a beam of energy at you, you will cease to exist, right? That's it. Done. Gone forever. But the kicker about this is you have to be a believer, which is to say you have to be someone who submits themselves to the laws of Aura Serrata and these mutants that exist on Mars. If you don't, she can't really do anything to you. In the case of Genesis, she's a believer. So if Aura Serrata turns her gaze to Genesis, it's game over, right? That's it. Genesis is done and gone. And so when Aura Serrata steps up and says, no, these are how things are going to be. She basically says, Sodas Exotica, you have a legal permission to proceed. And what Sodas Exotica can do is basically transmogrify sea life. In effect, mutate and modify existing life that's out there. And so by cutting his hand and dripping his blood into the water, one of these fish, if you want to call it that, again, it's a lot of symbolism, right? One of them is chosen to imbue the great power of these Arakko mutants and then, jump into the fray and help them in their fight against Storm and her forces. And so at that point, you switch over to Storm. And what ends up happening in the Citadel, where her forces are taking up residence in this moment of reprieve, is one of these mutated fish emerges as just like this gigantic sea monster. Now, any reasonable person would look at this and say, oh my god, right? They would be overwhelmed, they would be fearful, so on and so forth. Not Storm. Let me tell you something, man. Storm. Son. Dude, Storm, this is one of the reasons why I love Storm so much. This chick is fearless, man. This girl knows no fear. Literally, she sees this thing and she's like, nope, not happening. That is not going to happen today. Because for someone like Storm, whether or not a foe can be overcome has nothing to do with their physical size. Absolutely nothing to do with it. Storm is one of these where she maintains almost just complete and total confidence in our abilities almost 100% of the time. Because to mess with Storm is to mess with the power of the world itself. The entire Earth's ecosystem, right? The weather, it's a fool's errand. It's really what it is. So what this chick does is she flies up into the air. It's one of the most boss things that I think I've ever seen Storm do. She flies up into the air. She manipulates the cold. Literally, she freezes the air and the ambient water vapor and creates this gigantic spike of ice and brings the thing crashing down into this monster's head. And just like that, the whole thing's done. Donezo. Dead. And just like that. This is why Storm is so overpowered and so amazing in Marvel Comics. Because in years past in Marvel, it was just kind of I can make it really cold, or I can make it really warm, or I can fly using the wind, or I could blow you 10 feet in that direction. But over the years in Marvel Comics, man, Storm's powers have just been manipulated and adjusted and changed with unique ways to use them by different writers over the course of Marvel Comics. And you just end up with moments like this where it's absolutely insane. And so in response to that, what you end up having is kind of like a spy, quote unquote, that starts to manifest that this is basically a gigantic Trojan horse. That's all this was. It was never about sending this monster in to destroy the forces of Storm. It was sending this monster in to unleash a greater monster. And initially it's Fisher King, right? Kind of one of the generals of Storm. Then initially figures this out, that when this monster lays dead, its back cracks open. And then these vines start to emerge. And as soon as that happens, Fisher King immediately figures out, right? He tells Robert DaCosta, who can burn at the heat of the sun. He tells this guy, destroy the vines right now, burn the corpse. But the fact is, it's too late. These vines start to emerge, and then a giant portal, right? Literally, an Okara gate starts to open up. What's an Okara gate? The Okara gates are the gateway between the dimensional realm of Arakko out there in whatever landscape it happens to be in, and the real world. For this gate to basically build and to activate, God only knows what's coming from the other side. But Fisher King effectively knows. He can make an incredibly accurate guess. Because remember, on the other side of this is a whole host of just demonic beings. And lest we forget, that golden helmet that Genesis is wearing, that's the helmet of Ameth. Anybody who wears that helmet controls these demonic forces. And so, once that happens and that gate opens up, Genesis literally says, invade, move forward. And through this gate are not just these demonic forces, but the children of Apocalypse, right? These four, the guy who looks like a pharaoh, the guy who looks like Anubis, the one with their head on fire, the one with the red dome and the two spikes sticking up, right? The White King and his 100 forces, the 100 soldiers who cannot die, who are basically immortal, they all come pouring through. If ever there were an instance where Storm and her forces had no chance to survive, This is it, because this war is effectively donezo unless something comes out of somewhere that can bolster the powers of Storm or the forces of Storm. There's no conceivable way that they can win. With that being said, guys, we're going to bring this to an end. If you need to get caught up on Fall of X, make sure you guys click this link to the playlist, and I will catch you all later. Peace.